It occurred to me one day while I was thoughtfully gazing out over the field of cubifiers that I have been terribly remiss in talking about a certain franchise or IP or universe or whatever you want to call it that is very, very popular among science fiction fans. In fact, the game that kicked it off, the games that are basically the backbone of the entire universe, are widely considered to be the most influential video games of all times, and certainly probably the most influential real-time strategy game of all time. And yes, for those of y'all who are just now catching up with what I'm putting down, I am in fact referring to StarCraft. Any ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards. Now for those, I imagine very few of you in the audience who do not know what StarCraft is, it is in fact a real-time strategy video game that was released on 31 March 1998 by your calendar. And it was naturally made by Blizzard back when Blizzard was actually pretty good. It does share some commonalities with Warcraft, the real-time strategy game of the other genre that Blizzard made, to the point that it was actually built off of Warcraft 2's engine, which didn't go so well the first time they tried to pre-release and show it off. So it underwent some massive changes and then became the game that everyone knows and loves. And yes, in fact, this is a game that even I used to play all those orbits ago, back when connecting to your intertubes was even harder than it is now, and I had to sacrifice a minion every time I wanted to do it, and their screams carried me to your internets. Yeah, it wasn't a good time of your history. But regardless, the game follows the progression of 3 independent species in the Corpulu sector, which is basically apparently the sector that is not where Earth is. It's where a colonist ship ended up. It's complicated. There's a whole backstory. There's all kinds of side stories and this, that, and the other. But the upshot is that there are humans, yes. There are Protoss, okay. And there are the Zerg. And yes, the Zerg are in fact the originators of the concept of the Zerg Rush. This game is pretty much responsible for that entire meme. But incidentally, the main ground-pounding troop of the Humies are Space Marines. Oh. And the Zerg are kind of this all-consuming hive mind, vaguely insectoid species that just spreads their organic matter all over a planet and just consumes it down to its core. Oh. And then the Protoss are this enigmatic, very psionically oriented, very technology-oriented species that has remarkably powerful units that all cost more than they probably should. Oh. Are you starting to see some funny commonalities? Now, there are technically some hypotheses floating around that StarCraft was initially meant to be a Warhammer 40,000 style real-time strategy game, and negotiations between Blizzard and Games Workshop fell apart and Blizzard plowed on ahead. I have not been able to find any actual substantiation of these rumors, but yes, the Humies have Space Marines, the Zerg are basically the Tyranids, and the Protoss are basically the Eldar, if you squint hard enough. Or, I'm sorry, the Eldari, since apparently Eldar got Games Workshop in a lot of trouble because, Tolkien! And honestly, this is part of the reason why I don't really care that StarCraft may or may not have been riffed off of Warhammer 40,000. As we talked about previously in a previous episode, Warhammer 40,000 basically riffed off everything else. So if your entire product is derivative, you can't really complain if people derive new things off your product. Although Games Workshop goes out of its way to engage in all the possible lawfare it possibly can, which is part of the reason why I largely don't talk about their stuff. You would think they would love free advertising, but I feel certain that I would fall afoul of some pencil-necked, paper-pushing weenie in their legal department, and suddenly my life would be a lot more complicated than it needed to be. But enough about those self-absorbed a-holes. We're talking about StarCraft, which, yes, was so popular and is still so popular that, as far as I know, there are still competitive events taking place in South Korea, probably for StarCraft 2 specifically, but StarCraft 1 was remastered and re-released about, 8 orbits ago, so maybe still that. Regardless, yes, this game was that big of a deal, and by competitive events in South Korea, I mean there was actual currency on the line. It was like maybe not the beginning of esports, but it definitely helped kick off the concept of esports, which, by the way, still just strikes me as a ridiculously stupid concept. I will never understand the concept of live streaming. I engage in live streaming and y'all seem to enjoy it, and therefore I will continue. But personally, I have never actually watched other people play games unless I'm trying to figure out a solution to a problem that I haven't been able to figure out otherwise. I would prefer to play the game myself, but you humies do weird things, so here we are. Regardless, sorry, I keep getting distracted. We are here to talk about StarCraft, and specifically, we are here to talk about a specific ship from StarCraft, because that is, after all, what we do on this channel. Interestingly, the Humies have a lot of interesting toys, as you might expect, because, Humies. Most notably, they have a nuclear missile silo, which they strap onto their command center for some reason. Odd choice, but I guess where else are you going to put it? And that nuclear missile silo naturally houses a single solitary nuclear missile. It can be reloaded after you fire it, and it does require a Humie on the ground putting basically a laser dot on where you want the missile to go. The Humie in question is a ghost, and that's a whole separate topic of conversation, especially concerning the game. But once he drops that little laser designator, the silo launches this missile, and behold, nuclear bomb hits. Boom! The important detail of that nuclear bomb is it does 500 damage, or removes 2/3 of the total hit points of a unit for everything within the blast radius. And yes, that means basically every single unit, standard unit that is, not a hero unit, in the game is dead if they're inside the blast unit. Except for one. Amusingly, that one unit that can survive a direct nuclear hit is also a Humie unit, and the topic of today's episode. And for those of y'all who have played the game, you already know what I'm talking about, but for the rest of y'all, I am in fact referring to the Terran Battlecruiser. Now, interestingly, the Battlecruiser itself only has 500 hit points on its hull, however, it also has armor, which ameliorates some of the nuclear damage being dealt to it by said nuclear bomb, so it technically survives, but just barely. However, it is basically the only unit, standard unit again, in the game that can survive a direct nuclear strike. So it's notable for that alone. Now understand that battlecruisers are basically late-game bosses simply because of the tech tree necessary to produce them. And also understand that I'm mostly just talking about the first game in this episode. Maybe we'll talk about the StarCraft 2 battleships, battlecruisers in the future, but right now I'm just focusing on the first one because there's enough to talk about there already. Regardless, battlecruisers require a control tower to be attached to a starport. Okay, fine. Except a starport itself requires a factory to be built, and a factory requires a barracks to be built. And thankfully, the barracks only requires your command center to exist. So at least there's just that. Think of your command center as the town square, the barracks as the infantry generation system, the factory as the vehicle generation system, and the starport, naturally, as the air combat vehicle generation system. It's all pretty straightforward, aside from the fact that all of those buildings I just mentioned, aside from the control tower itself, can get up and move. Yes, you heard that right. One of the features built into the Terran Confederation, and it is unique to the Terrans, is that their buildings can actually pack up, lift up off the ground, and fly somewhere else. This is supposed to make resource gathering easier because the little SCVs, the little resource gatherers for the Terrans, take all their stuff back to the command center. So once you mine out your Vespene gas or your crystal things or whatever the hell, you can pack up your command center and move it somewhere else and mine some more stuff. Except they move really, really, really slow. And you can't actually drop off any materials while it is in flight. I'm certainly not going to say that I was ever an outstanding StarCraft player, but I use the flying building ability not that often. Especially since once the building lifts off, it leaves behind all of its little attachments. Like, for example, that control tower that would be attached to the starport. But speaking of the control tower, that was not the only thing you actually needed to have to build the battlecruiser. You would also need a physics lab, which would have to be attached to a science facility, which requires the existence of a starport. So, again, quite a tech tree to get up to this battlecruiser. But once you're there, you're pretty much good to go. Like we talked about previously, it has 500 hit points, the highest of any standard unit in the game, on top of 3 points of Neosteel armor. What is Neosteel? No one knows. It's unobtainium. It's fine. On top of that, it has 4 forward-firing burst lasers. Now, technically, they are burst laser batteries, so I'm not sure if there's 2 burst laser batteries, because there's 2 burst lasers port side and 2 more starboard side. So is that 2 batteries, 1 on each side? Is each laser cannon a battery by itself? I'm not really sure, but regardless, it has 4 laser guns facing forward. And these are mounted port and starboard, kind of to the stern amidship section. The ship has a very pronounced design, and the laser cannons are on, let's call them the wings. But that hammerhead, head, that houses the fun toy. And by fun toy, I mean the Yamato gun. And by Yamato gun, I mean pretty much exactly what you're thinking of if you know anything about Space Battleship Yamato. Yeah, it's a massive, honking, spinal cannon. Now, in the StarCraft Battlecruiser context, though, it's a little more interesting than that, in that it's basically a Kasaba howitzer. Only it's not single use, and it's a lot more complicated. But anyways, the Yamato cannon takes a nuclear bomb, detonates it, contains it, and then directs it. And that directed energy burst does 260 points of damage to any single given target you point it at. And yes, that is half the hull points of the battlecruiser itself, even accounting for the armor. It's a big honking gun. And like I said, it's reusable. The battlecruiser generates energy, and it expends energy to fire the Yamato gun, so it just has to recharge its energy battery, and then boom, you can shoot it again. And conveniently, its functional range is greater than most anti-air capabilities are, so you can engage targets before they can engage you, and destroy them with relative impunity. And yes, I will do an episode about the Kasaba howitzer at some point in the future. That is why I'm kind of glossing over it at the moment. But regardless, directed nuclear bomb, how can you go wrong with that? But in case you want to mix it up and get it dirty, those laser cannons bolted onto the sides of the battlecruiser put out 25 damage per shot, basically. By way of comparison, the Mark I Mod 0 Humi Space Marine puts out 6 damage per shot, and only has 40 hit points with no armor. So yeah, 2 shots from a battlecruiser, and a guy in a powered tin can is suddenly, expired. In fact, those 3 points of armor on the battlecruiser may not sound like a lot, but the Protoss carrier is basically the only other big boy aircraft in the game, and it's generally recommended that they shouldn't engage battlecruisers because they rely on interceptors to do the damage to other ships. And the individual interceptor shots are barely strong enough to get through that armor. So yeah, battlecruisers done bring the hurt and can take a whole lot of hurt themselves. The only significant catch is that they really can't run away. In fact, they barely move at all. They are not the slowest unit in the game, but they are one of the slowest units in the game, and if the battle starts going sideways and they try to run away, they're gonna have a bad time. And this is largely because of its overall design. All the weapons face forward. You have 4 massive laser cannons facing forward. You have a Yamato gun facing forward. It has no side weapons. It has no stern weapons. It has no up or down weapons. It has no turrets. In fact, when it's engaging like a swarm of targets, the little sprite that is the battlecruiser zips back and forth between engaging target over here and target over there and target way over there. It can rotate on a dime instantaneously. It just can't run very fast. And this is where things get weird, because yes, what I've been talking about so far is the in-game version of the battlecruiser, specifically the StarCraft 1 variant. And yeah, fundamentally the design is absolutely idiotic. All the weapons are forward-facing, it's a slow ship. Technically it should be a slow maneuvering ship, but for whatever reason the game didn't actually take into account rotational velocities of the given units, so they can just spin on a dime and shoot something else regardless of how slow they might be able to move or not, depending. And basically all the significant details are glossed over. However, as with so many other games on your planet, there is so much more to StarCraft than simply the games. For example, the actual StarCraft game, the first one that is, takes place in maybe a 6-month window between December 2499 and June 2500. That's it. And by that time, the battlecruisers that were in service in StarCraft 1, that is to say the Behemoth-class battlecruisers, had already been in service for, let's go with 20 years. And they would stay in service for another decade after StarCraft 1. And I mean, in fairness, 30 to 40 years of service is not that long of a time of, well, service. But understand that the Behemoth class, the one that we're talking about for StarCraft 1, was succeeded by the Hercules class, which was succeeded by the Minotaur class, which was succeeded by the Gorgon class, which was succeeded by the Moray class, which was succeeded by the Sovereign class, and basically you Humies really kind of got hung up on your hammer-headed styled battlecruisers. So the idea stuck around, but maybe not the original one. And the original one is so very complicated. For example, the battlecruiser from the First Great War, that is to say StarCraft 1, had a crew somewhere in the range of 500 to 1,000. Whereas by the end of the Second Great War, that is to say StarCraft 2, the Behemoth class, the same class as in StarCraft 1, had a crew of nearly 6,000. Why? Where? Where did you put all those squishies? Like, seriously, the space frame is about the same size either way, and I know size in StarCraft is somewhat complicated because a Wraith is nearly like a quarter the size of a battlecruiser, and yet battlecruisers carry Wraiths for self-defense. So again, I know it's complicated, but still, how did your crew sextuple and your space frame remain the same? Did y'all just abandon the concept of automation or something? Seems like. And while, yes, the older versions of the ships did not have side-firing arcs for their laser batteries, the newer versions of the Behemoth did. But perhaps more importantly, all of the Behemoths in the story had nuclear bombs as, weaponized warheads. Most of those nuclear warheads were designed for orbital bombardment, although some Behemoths were equipped with 10-kiloton ship-to-ship warheads, but still, the game would have you believe that the only nukes the Behemoths used were the Yamato cannon chargers, or whatever you want to call those. But no, in fact, the Behemoths actually had nuclear-tipped missiles that they could launch at whatever the hell they wanted. And, well, wow, that never came up in the game, did it? And beyond that, the storyline Behemoths not only had their Neo-Steel armor, but they also had energy shields, which, again, never really came up in the game at all. In fact, their energy shields were so good that the hangars on the Behemoths were actually atmosphere-contained by way of, yes, you guessed it, energy shields. And those hangars actually contained everything from Wraiths to scout ships to drop ships and shuttles, because after all, these are Behemoths, aptly named at that, and they could carry hundreds to thousands of troops. And they would have to put the troops on the planet, right? Yeah, all these mechanics never came up in the game. I mean, admittedly, the game was pretty simple and straightforward at the time, but wow, we're glossing over a lot of details over these battlecruisers, aren't we? And unfortunately, thanks to this being a game and a real-time strategy game with basically like little proxy figurines holding the place of actual combat vehicles, because after all, the siege tank is nearly the same size as the battlecruiser, and those vehicles are not nearly the same size at all in reality, whatever that looks like. There's no real way of determining exactly how big the battlecruiser is. I mean, yes, there are crew numbers. The crew numbers are highly erratic and non-consistent. There are weapons, and it's unclear whether a battery refers to 2 guns together or just 1 gun or something more than that. There's all kinds of details missing here to allow us to give some kind of context to the situation. But one thing is absolutely for certain. Samwise Didier was a master. And in his own words, he smashed rectangles and squares together and created the Hammerhead-style battlecruiser. And it remains one of his proudest contributions to Blizzard's universe. And it should remain one of his proudest contributions to Blizzard's universe. Because when you Humies say science fiction battlecruiser, you're probably going to think of the Behemoth or something in that family. Because, yeah, basically every single battlecruiser that came after the Behemoth borrowed at least some design details from the original, the OG battlecruiser from StarCraft 1. It's still not a great design. Every weapon faces forward, and it all relies on the ship being able to turn on a dime. But in terms of stylistic impact, in terms of memorable ship designs, yeah, you're not going to remember it for the 4 engines, because after all, redundancy is great and all, but it's not very stylistically impactful. But that hammerhead braced by those 2 batteries of laser cannons, yeah, you're going to remember that. And you're sure as hell going to remember it when it pops off a nuclear bomb inside of it and somehow uses electromagnetic fields to direct that detonation into your face. Well, you would remember it if you were still alive, I suppose. Details. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.